The moment one dress changed everything, I realized the biggest transformations in life don't always begin with a huge decision. Sometimes they begin with one small moment that forces you to look at yourself differently. That day started like any other. I was living a life built around routine. Every morning followed the same pattern. Every decision was based on what was expected, what was familiar, and what felt safe. From the outside, everything looked fine. But inside, there was always a feeling that something important was missing. Not success, not comfort, something deeper. A connection with myself that I had ignored for too long. I had spent years trying to understand the person everyone else wanted me to be. I followed invisible rules and avoided anything that made me question my identity. Then one evening, while organizing old belongings, I found a dress that had been forgotten in a storage box. It was just a piece of clothing. Nothing more. At least, that's what I thought. Holding it in my hands brought back memories of all the times I had ignored my own curiosity and avoided exploring new experiences because of fear. The fear wasn't about the dress. The fear was about what it represented. A choice. A question. A chance to understand a side of myself I had never allowed enough space. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and realized something important. The reflection wasn't asking me to become someone else. It was asking me to be honest. For years, I believed confidence came from meeting other people's expectations. But I was beginning to understand that real confidence comes from accepting yourself while continuing to grow. That one moment changed the way I looked at every tomorrow that followed. The next morning, life looked the same. The same streets, the same responsibilities, the same world. But my perspective had changed. I started paying attention to things I had ignored before. I started listening to my own thoughts instead of constantly judging them. I started learning that self-understanding is not something that happens instantly. It is a journey, a process, a collection of small discoveries. Over the following weeks, I wrote down my thoughts in a notebook. I didn't write about becoming a different person. I wrote about becoming a more honest version of myself. Every page carried a lesson. One page said, "Growth begins when you stop being afraid of questions." Another said, "Understanding yourself is more important than satisfying every expectation." Those lessons slowly changed my daily life. I became more confident in conversations. I became more open to learning. I stopped seeing every difference as something negative. Instead, I saw it as another part of a much bigger story. One afternoon, I talked with a close friend about the changes happening in my life. They noticed that I seemed calmer. "You seem more comfortable with yourself," they said. I smiled. "I think I'm finally learning who I am." That conversation stayed with me. Because sometimes the biggest changes are not visible to other people. Sometimes the greatest transformation happens inside your own mind. Months passed. The dress that once represented uncertainty became a reminder of courage. Not because of the clothing itself, because of the decision to stop hiding from personal growth. I learned that every person has moments that challenge their understanding of themselves. Everyone has experiences that teach them something new. Everyone has a journey that looks different from the outside. The important thing is not comparing your path with someone else's. The important thing is being willing to learn from your own. 1 year later, I looked back at that first moment and realized why it mattered so much. The dress didn't change my life. The courage to face myself did. That was the real transformation. A single choice created a new perspective. A new perspective created new decisions. And those decisions created new tomorrows. Because sometimes the smallest moments become the ones that change everything. After that day, I began to notice something I had never paid attention to before. The biggest changes in life are often invisible at the beginning. Nobody else could see the thoughts I was changing, the fears I was leaving behind, or the confidence I was slowly building. But I could feel it. I started making choices with a different mindset. Instead of asking, "Will people approve?" I started asking, "Does this help me understand myself better?" That one question changed the way I approached everything. I began exploring new interests, learning new skills, and allowing myself to experience life without constantly judging every decision. For so long, I had believed that being accepted by others was the same as being happy. Now I understood that acceptance from others is valuable, but acceptance from yourself is where true peace begins. One weekend, I visited a small clothing store in an unfamiliar part of town. The owner was an older woman who had worked there for decades. While looking around, I noticed how carefully she treated every item in the store. She didn't see clothes as simple objects. She saw stories. She noticed the details, the design, the effort, the emotions connected to every choice people made. Asked her why she cared so much about something that many people considered ordinary. She smiled and said, "People often think clothing changes who they are, but sometimes clothing only reveals what was already there." Those words stayed in my mind, because they explained something I had been slowly discovering. The important part was never the outside. The important part was the confidence, understanding, and honesty that came from within. Later that evening, I wrote another note in my journal. Never let a single moment define your entire story. Let it become a chapter. That sentence became important to me, because everyone has moments they remember forever. A conversation, a decision, a discovery, something small that creates a completely different direction. The challenge is recognizing those moments when they happen. A few months later, I found myself helping others who were also searching for confidence in their own lives. Some people struggled with expressing themselves. Some people were afraid of change. Some people felt trapped by expectations they never chose. I listened to their stories and realized something powerful. Everyone carries a hidden journey. Everyone has questions they're trying to answer. Everyone deserves patience while figuring themselves out. One person told me, "I wish I had started understanding myself earlier." I smiled because I knew that feeling, but I also knew something else. There is no perfect time to begin. The best moment is the moment you decide to stop ignoring yourself. Years ago, I thought one dress changed every tomorrow because of the dress itself. Now I understood the truth. It was the courage behind that choice that created change. The courage to explore. The courage to learn. The courage to accept that growth can come from unexpected places. And that lesson stayed with me. Because sometimes life gives us a small moment that opens a much bigger door. The question is not whether that moment will appear. The question is whether we will have the courage to walk through it. As the years moved forward, I began to understand that the real impact of that moment was not seen immediately. A single choice had started a process of learning that continued every day. The person I was before that moment was always searching for certainty. I wanted every answer before taking the first step. I wanted guarantees before trying something new. But life rarely works that way. Most important discoveries happen while we are still learning. I started keeping track of the small victories that nobody else noticed. Speaking honestly during a difficult conversation. Trying something unfamiliar without fear. Accepting mistakes without letting them destroy my confidence. Those moments seemed small, but together they created something much bigger. They created trust in myself. One afternoon, I found an old photograph from before that important day. I looked at it carefully. The person in the picture was not unhappy, but there was something missing. A sense of freedom, a willingness to explore, a belief that personal growth was possible. I placed the photograph beside a newer one. The difference was not something that could be measured by appearance. It was in the expression. The newer picture showed someone who had stopped fighting against their own thoughts. Someone who had learned to move forward with patience. That evening, I visited a quiet park where I used to go whenever I needed time to think. I sat on a bench and watched people passing by. Everyone was carrying a story. The person walking their dog. The artist drawing in a notebook. The couple having a quiet conversation. The child learning something new. Every person was changing in ways nobody else could see. That realization made me appreciate my own journey even more. We often compare our behind-the-scenes struggles with someone else's finished moments. But every person is still becoming. Nobody arrives at a final version of themselves. Life continues teaching. Life continues surprising us. A few weeks later, I started a personal project focused on helping people discover their confidence through creativity. The goal was simple. Create a space where people could experiment learn, and express their ideas without fear of judgment. At the beginning, only a few people joined. But slowly, more people became interested. Each person brought a different story, different experiences, different dreams. Watching them grow reminded me of my own beginning. The same uncertainty, the same questions, the same desire to understand themselves better. One evening after a workshop, someone asked me, "What was the biggest lesson you learned from your journey?" I thought about the answer carefully. Then I said, "The biggest lesson was realizing that change does not always create a new person. Sometimes it reveals the person who is already there." Those words felt true, because the journey had never been about becoming someone completely different. It was about removing the fear that prevented me from seeing myself clearly. When I returned home that night, I stood in front of the mirror again. This time, there was no searching, no confusion, no pressure, just a quiet moment of appreciation. I remembered the first time I looked into that mirror and felt uncertain. I remembered how one small experience created a question. That question created curiosity. Curiosity created growth. And growth created a new way of living. The dress was only the beginning. The real transformation happened in every choice that came afterward. Every tomorrow changed because I changed the way I looked at myself today. Years later, I realized something that I had never understood at the beginning of my journey. The most powerful changes are not the ones that happen in front of a mirror. They are the ones that happen when nobody is watching. They happen in quiet decisions, in private thoughts, in the moments when you choose courage over fear. Looking back, I could clearly see how every small experience had connected to create something meaningful. The first moment created curiosity. Curiosity created learning. Learning created confidence. And confidence changed the way I approached the world. One morning, while organizing my old belongings, I found the notebook where I had written my earliest thoughts. The pages were filled with questions from a person who was trying to understand themselves. Reading those words brought back many memories. The uncertainty, the hesitation, the fear of making the wrong choice. But instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt grateful. That version of myself had taken the first step. Without that first step, none of the growth that followed would have happened. I added a new sentence at the bottom of the final page. Never underestimate the power of a beginning. Because every meaningful journey starts somewhere. A simple idea, a small decision, a moment of curiosity. People often wait for a perfect opportunity to change their lives. But perfection rarely arrives. The people who grow are usually the ones who begin before they feel completely ready. That lesson became something I shared with others. Not because I had all the answers, because I knew what it felt like to search for them. One day, I met someone who reminded me of my younger self. They were full of potential, but constantly doubted themselves. They had many ideas but were afraid to take action. "I don't know if I can do it," they said. I smiled and replied, "You don't need to know everything before you start. You only need the courage to learn the next step." They thought about that for a moment. Then they smiled. Sometimes people don't need someone to change their path. They just need someone to remind them that they are capable of walking it. That evening, I returned home and looked at the old dress that had started this entire journey. It was no longer a symbol of uncertainty. It was a reminder of the day I stopped ignoring questions. A reminder of the day I allowed myself to learn. A reminder that one moment can create a completely different future. But the truth was simple. The dress itself had never changed anything. The transformation came from the courage to explore, reflect, and grow. That was the lesson I carried forward. A person is not defined by one moment. A person is shaped by every choice they make after that moment. The challenges they overcome. The lessons they accept. The courage they build. Standing there, I smiled because I finally understood the meaning behind everything. One dress changed every tomorrow. Not because it created someone new, because it helped reveal someone who had been waiting to be discovered all along. Time continued moving forward, and life brought new chapters that I never expected. The strange thing about transformation is that people often imagine it as one dramatic event. They imagine one moment where everything changes forever. But the truth is different. Real change is usually quiet. It happens slowly through thousands of small choices. The way you speak to yourself, the way you handle challenges, the way you allow yourself to learn. Those small choices become the foundation of who you become. One evening, I was invited to a gathering where people shared stories about important moments in their lives. Everyone had a different experience. Some talked about career changes. Some talked about overcoming fears. Some talked about discovering new passions. When it was my turn, I looked around the room and thought about where my own story had started. A simple moment, a simple choice, a simple realization. I told them that sometimes the smallest things can open the biggest doors. Not because those things have magical power, because they give us a chance to see ourselves differently. After the gathering, someone approached me. They said, "Your story made me realize I have been ignoring something important about myself." I smiled. Maybe the first step is simply paying attention. They nodded. That conversation reminded me of another lesson. Our journeys are not only about ourselves. Sometimes our experiences become lights that help others find their own direction. Months later, I returned to the place where I had first discovered that forgotten dress. The room looked different. The furniture had changed. The walls had been painted, but the feeling remained. I stood there quietly and remembered the person I was back then. Someone who was afraid of questions. Someone who wanted every answer before beginning. Someone who believed uncertainty was a sign to stop. Now I understood uncertainty differently. It wasn't a wall. It was an invitation. An invitation to learn. An invitation to grow. An invitation to discover something new. I opened my notebook one final time and wrote a few words. Every tomorrow is created by today's courage. I closed the notebook and placed it away. Not because the story was ending, because a new chapter was always waiting. The journey had taught me that life is not about finding one final version of yourself. It is about continuing to grow through every experience, every challenge, every opportunity. The person in the mirror today may not be the same person tomorrow. And that is not something to fear. That is something to celebrate. Because change means you are still learning. You are still moving. You are still becoming. Years ago, I thought one dress changed every tomorrow. Now I understood the deeper truth. The dress was only a moment. The real transformation was the courage that followed. And that courage continued shaping every tomorrow that came after. Years had passed since that first moment, but the lesson remained stronger than ever. I often wondered what would have happened if I had ignored that small turning point. What if I had continued living only according to expectations? What if I had never allowed myself to explore, learn, and understand? The answer was simple. I would have missed an important part of my own journey. That realization made me appreciate every step that followed. Not because everything was easy. It wasn't. There were still difficult days. There were still moments of doubt. There were still times when I questioned my decisions. But the difference was that I no longer saw those moments as reasons to stop. I saw them as opportunities to learn. One evening, I looked through everything I had collected over the years. The old notebook, the photographs, the memories. Each item represented a different stage of growth. The person who started the journey was searching for answers. The person standing there now understood that life is not about having every answer. It is about being willing to continue asking better questions. I placed the old dress carefully away, not as something that changed my life, but as a reminder of the courage it took to begin. Because the most important part of any journey is not the object, the place, or the moment where it starts. It is the person you become, because you chose to continue. Looking back, I finally understood the meaning behind those words. One dress changed every tomorrow. Not because fabric has the power to transform a life. Not because one moment can create an entire future. But because sometimes a small experience gives us the courage to look deeper, to question, to learn,
to grow.
The biggest changes often begin quietly. A single thought, a single choice, a single moment where you decide to stop running from yourself. And once that decision is made, every tomorrow has the chance to become something new. Years later, when I looked into the mirror, I no longer searched for a different person. I saw someone who had learned from every experience, Someone who had grown through every challenge. Someone who finally understood that the journey itself was the greatest transformation. The reflection looking back was not a stranger. It was the result of every choice, every lesson, and every brave step along the way. And that was the true meaning of change. Not becoming someone else. Becoming more honest with who you already are. Because sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest futures. And sometimes one simple choice can change every tomorrow that follows.